call, Claire Curran.
Talofa lafa, Mr. Speaker.
Talofa.
Mr. Speaker, well, I'll say something for the government, and that is that they're good at the spin. They're good at the political spin. They're good at telling you that everything's great when behind the scenes it's another story. And I listened to the previous speaker, the new Associate Finance Minister, talk about fundamentally moving resources to where they're needed most. Well, how does that fit with what they're doing to social housing? Fundamentally dismantling the social housing scheme, the state housing, the role of the state in providing housing for the most vulnerable in our society. Not one more house is coming out of their new grand new plan, which isn't a real plan. I'd also like to say to the previous National Speaker, new MP Barbara Kruger, who spoke about the importance of fast broadband in rural New Zealand, and that is so important. It is so important that that there is the right investment and the investment going where it's needed. Unfortunately, and I'm sure she, as an MP in rural New Zealand and the Taranaki, would know. In fact, I know that she does know, because I know that she has many people coming through her door complaining about their broadband, is that the government's already spent $300 million in rural New Zealand and it's still not working. And that's a real problem, which is why Labor fought against that piece of legislation pushed through under urgency on Friday night. My colleague Grant Robertson described this as a politician's budget. It's also been described as many things, but one of them being a budget of broken promises. Budget of broken promises around the surplus, around wage and job targets, and of course those 3 new taxes. No new taxes, said the Prime Minister. No new taxes, said the campaign literature before the election. Well, what have we got? We've got 3 new taxes. Rod Oram, the economist Rod Oram, put it really well when he said in the Sunday Star Times this weekend, quote, "This budget, like the 6 before it, is a triumph of micromanagement. The government has mastered the art of switching small sums of money around to give the illusion of progress." Well, how true that is. How true that is. The sticking plaster budget, the piecemeal budget with no vision, no plan, and no real hope. $25 a week, yes, absolutely acknowledge that's going to make a small difference. But you tell me, excuse me, Mr. Speaker, not you, but can the government tell me how is that going to address the fundamental causes of child poverty? Well, it's just not. If you live in regional New Zealand, you could be forgiven for barely registering this budget. Once upon a time, Mr. Speaker, as I'm sure you would remember, Mr. Speaker, that, and many of the people in the House would recall, the budget was a must-listen-to yearly event. There were big structural changes, there were wide-ranging visions, and it was an opportunity for governments of the day to show their core thinking and direction. This budget has no structural shifts in it. There's no accounting for the ageing population. There's no recognition of the rapid technological change and the impact on jobs. There's no money for innovation. There's no money for regional development. There's no money for the productive economy and for exports. There's no investment in those things. Instead, we've had Kickstart, KiwiSavers Kickstart, snatched away, the savings of future generations. Mr. Speaker, this is a budget of broken promises. We've seen The taxing of capital gains, not a capital gains tax, but the taxing of capital gains for property investors expanded. An airport tax charging people to enter or leave New Zealand. And thirdly, a broadband tax, which increases the charge on telecommunications industry, which has already resulted in an increase in broadband prices. And we've got a minister, Amy Adams, Communications Minister, who doesn't talk to the industry or to the consumers or to consumer representatives. She doesn't listen. She insists that black is white. In fact, she stood in this House on Friday night and insisted that a levy is not a tax. Well, I just want to show everybody Colin James's piece in the ODT this morning, the Otago Daily Times, the headline, "We know a levy's a tax, Mr. English." I think the government has lost on that one. Ram through a special law under urgency to give the government power to levy or tax the telecommunications industry to implement part 2 of a scheme for rural broadband, which was $150 million. So, Mr. Speaker, why did we fight it? We support better broadband, absolutely, for rural New Zealand. It was us that provided the strong policy leading into the election for community-based rural broadband to try and address the real issues that were happening in rural New Zealand. But $300 million has already been spent in rural New Zealand and has not been a great success. How do we know this? We know this because rural New Zealand keep telling us, whether they're petitions from communities that come to select committees in Parliament, as they did, 3 of them did last week, whether it's organisations like Rural Women who come and talk to us about the state of rural broadband. We know that Federated Farmers is worried. We even know that 68% of businesses and households are extremely frustrated in rural New Zealand because there was a piece of market research by Colmar Brunton for Chorus done just before the election. So that there's been no analysis, no reports. The only figures that we have, a few thousand connections, there's been towers upgraded and new ones built, and the copper network has been improved. But this is infrastructure that's owned by private companies who are benefiting from it. Is it benefiting rural New Zealand? Where is the analysis? Where are the reports? I note that they've all got their heads down over there because they know there aren't any. So what does the minister say? Well, it's my way or the highway, she says to everybody. She says it's a levy, it's not a tax. She said the telecommunications companies wouldn't pass it on. Well, within an hour of the debate starting in Parliament last week, one of the telcos had already announced they were passing it on because it was a tax. Now, whether that's a good thing or not is to one side, but the fact is that that's what it's happening, and it's a tax on consumers. And she, of course, said that that wouldn't happen, and it did. Is a levy a tax? No, it's a user charge, says the minister. Is a tax on alcohol a user charge? Is a tax on cigarettes a user charge? Is a tax on petrol a user charge? Well, the minister has certainly lost the argument on that one. The $150 million, there's no guarantee it'll work. There's no guarantee that that money won't be used to finish off the first version of rural broadband. There's no guarantee that smaller community providers will get a look in. It needs an inquiry, it needs examination, it needs sunlight, and it shows poor economic management, poor judgment, and a fundamental lack of understanding and good project management. Today, Mr. Speaker, finishing up, Chorus came out today pleading with the government to move fast on RMA reforms in order to free up the roadblocks in the ultra-fast broadband project. Well, we've always said we would consider sensible changes in the RMA. We had some in our environment policy. We had policy in a telco policy that said we would fix these things as soon as possible. It's been 8 months since the election. There's been no movement on this. We say to the Minister for the Environment, put those changes on the table. Nick Smith, let's see them. Where are they? And good on Chorus for putting the pressure on that issue.